It was a stormy afternoon when I found myself standing outside the rusted gates of the Briarcliff Asylum, an eerie silhouette against the darkening sky. The place had been abandoned for years, but something about it never felt truly empty. Briarcliff wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, a cold memory of the dozens of unsolved murders and disappearances that haunted our town. And now, after all these years, I was here to reopen the case. I was never a believer in the supernatural, but something about the asylum gave me chills. The murders had started almost a decade ago, brutal, bloody, and ritualistic, each victim found mutilated in a manner that made even the most hardened detectives in our precinct lose their sleep. The killings had stopped abruptly when the asylum closed its doors, but I had always suspected that we had never caught the true culprit. Now, someone was leaving hints as if mocking us, daring me to pick up the pieces once more. As I stepped through the broken front door, the smell of mildew and decay hit me like a wave. The floor creaked beneath my boots, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the halls. Somewhere deep inside, I could still feel the terror that had lived here, feeding off the whispers of the dead. I had been here once before, many years ago, right after the last body had been found. But now, with fresh evidence in hand, I knew something far more sinister had taken place. My flashlight flickered to life, illuminating the corridor ahead. The police files had mentioned a series of cryptic notes left near the crime scenes, notes that had never been deciphered. And now, years later, more notes had begun appearing in places connected to the victims, each one a piece of the puzzle. But they weren't just from the past, they were fresh, and they seemed directed at me. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move just a little too fast, every distant sound felt like it was following me. But I wasn't here to be scared off, I was here for answers. I pulled out the latest note I had received, left at the grave of one of the victims. It was a simple line, "Come back to where it all started. The truth is still waiting." And so, here I was. Briarcliff, the heart of darkness. Just as I reached the main lobby, I froze. There, carved into the wall with something sharp and dripping darkly in the fading light, was a message, "You're getting closer." The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I had to remind myself to breathe as I scanned the room. But the most chilling part wasn't the message, it was the knowledge that someone, maybe even the killer, had been here recently. This was just the beginning. The walls of Briarcliff seemed to close in on me as I moved deeper into the asylum. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the old building settling. Every step I took echoed down the long, decaying hallways. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap, but I had no choice. The fresh message on the wall had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. Someone was watching, someone who knew the truth behind those murders. And now they were leading me, like a lamb to slaughter. I turned a corner, and there it was, the patient wing. Rows of metal doors stood in perfect stillness, their small, barred windows offering glimpses into rooms where sanity had once been questioned. I knew this part of the asylum well. It was where the most disturbed patients had been kept, locked away from the world. The smell of rot and decay hung heavy in the air, and the memories of the past seemed to seep from the walls like an invisible fog. As I walked past the old rooms, a scraping noise echoed from up ahead. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly as I directed it toward the source. Nothing moved. It was just the building, I told myself, just the old bones of Briarcliff creaking. But as I took another step, I caught sight of something on the floor. Blood. A dark trail of it, leading down the hallway and disappearing around a corner. My pulse quickened as I followed it, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But something deeper, something darker, pulled me forward. The blood led to one of the old patient rooms. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed on its rusty hinges. I nudged it open with my foot, shining the flashlight into the room. At first glance, it looked like any other abandoned space, mold-covered walls, a broken bed frame, and shattered glass from the window. But then I saw it. In the center of the room, tied to the rusted bed frame, was a bundle of old, yellowed papers, neatly arranged in a pile. I bent down, heart pounding in my chest, and carefully untied the twine that held the papers together. As I flipped through them, my stomach twisted into knots. They were detailed notes, journal entries, medical reports, and personal letters. Each one connected to the murders that had haunted our town. And as I skimmed through them, a name kept appearing over and over again. James Carrington. Carrington had been a low-level employee at Briarcliff, a quiet man who had kept to himself. He had worked here during the time of the murders but had vanished shortly after the asylum was closed. At the time, no one thought much of him. He had been considered just another face among the sea of staff. But these notes painted a very different picture. Carrington had been involved, deeply involved, in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And then there was another name, scribbled hastily in the margins of several documents, M. Graves. My mind raced. M. Graves, was that the coworker? The one who had slipped through the cracks, hiding in plain sight. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the halls. I jumped to my feet, clutching the papers in my hand as my flashlight flickered. The asylum had been empty, hadn't it? Panic surged through me as I backed away from the bed. The door to the room creaked slowly, as if someone, or something, was just outside. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. Whoever was toying with me, they knew I was here. They wanted me here. But why? Why lead me back to Briarcliff? Why now? I stepped into the hallway, flashlight shaking as I scanned the shadows. The building felt alive, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting for me to make a move. My mind raced with possibilities. Could Carrington still be alive? Had he somehow survived all these years, hiding in the ruins of the asylum? Or was someone else carrying out his twisted legacy? I took another step forward, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, drifting through the darkened hallway like a cold breath on the back of my neck. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was so close, it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the long, empty corridor stretching into the shadows. And then, just as I was about to move, I saw something scrawled in fresh blood on the wall beside me. He's not the only one. My heart pounded in my ears as I realized what it meant. This was far from over. The air inside the asylum felt heavier with every step I took, like it was trying to suffocate me. My mind raced, replaying the message on the wall, he's not the only one. It wasn't just Carrington. There was someone else, someone who had been helping him all along. The name scrawled in the margins of those notes, M. Graves, echoed in my head like a sinister riddle waiting to be solved. But now wasn't the time to think. I had to get out. The darkness of Briarcliff felt alive, like it was swallowing me whole, and I was sure someone, or something, was watching. I could feel eyes on me, lurking just beyond the range of my flashlight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I rushed back down the hallway, the echoes of my footsteps sounding far too loud in the silent building. The asylum seemed to twist and turn in ways I hadn't noticed before, as though the very layout was shifting, trying to keep me inside. I passed by the patient rooms, each door a black mouth yawning open into the void. A sudden clatter from behind me made me whip around. The beam of my flashlight danced over the cracked tiles, but I saw nothing. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short gasps as I turned another corner, trying to retrace my steps toward the entrance. And then I saw him. Standing at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the weak glow of my light, was a man. His figure was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadow. He was just standing there, motionless, like he'd been waiting for me. My heart lurched in my chest. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to steady my voice. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I took a cautious step forward, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles were white. I could feel the papers still tucked under my arm, the journal entries, the medical reports, all linking Carrington to the murders. But now, as I stared at the figure down the hall, a terrifying thought crept into my mind. What if Carrington wasn't the mastermind? What if this figure, this shadow, was? The silence stretched on, suffocating me. I took another step forward, but then the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, moving with a strange, fluid grace. My heart pounded in my chest as I broke into a run, chasing after him. My footsteps echoed off the walls, mingling with the sound of distant whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I rounded the corner where the figure had vanished and came to an abrupt stop. The hallway was a dead end. There was nowhere he could have gone. I scanned the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, searching for any sign of a hidden door or passage. But there was nothing. Just a solid, decaying wall where the figure had disappeared. Panic surged through me. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Had the asylum finally gotten into my head, or was I truly being hunted by something beyond explanation? I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned back the way I had come, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching into infinity as I ran. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on me, pressing against my skin like icy fingers. I rounded another corner and froze. There, scrawled in thick, dripping letters on the wall, was another message. This one was fresh, the blood still shining under my flashlight's beam. She's still here. The words sent a chill straight to my bones. I glanced over my shoulder, feeling like someone was standing right behind me. But there was nothing. Only the gaping darkness. My mind raced back to the notes I had found, the ones detailing the gruesome experiments Carrington had been involved in. There had been rumors about a patient, a woman who had been the subject of his darkest work. She had disappeared the night Briarcliff was shut down, her body never found. Had she been the key to everything? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the depths of the asylum, the sound reverberating off the walls. It came from behind me, down a hallway I had deliberately avoided, one that led to the underground tunnels, a network of corridors that had once connected Briarcliff to the nearby hospital. The thought of going down there sent a shudder through me, but I had no choice. If she was still here, if Carrington's twisted experiments had continued. I had to know. With a deep breath, I stepped toward the tunnel entrance. The air grew colder, staler, as I descended into the belly of the asylum. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely penetrating the darkness ahead. The walls down here were different, covered in strange symbols, markings I couldn't decipher. The deeper I went, the more the whispers seemed to intensify, voices overlapping in an eerie chorus of madness. At the end of the tunnel, I found it, an old, rusted door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, I heard the softest of whispers behind me. "Help me." I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. But then the whisper came again, closer this time, brushing against my ear. "Please, help." And that's when I realized the truth. She wasn't dead. And I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a freight train, she wasn't dead. The woman from Carrington's experiments, the one who had vanished without a trace, was still here. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the pitch-black tunnel behind me. My heart hammered in my chest, the rhythmic beat loud enough to drown out the eerie whispers. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable now, a woman's voice, weak and broken but persistent. She was calling to me. I swallowed the rising panic and turned back to the rusted door in front of me. This was it. Whatever nightmare lay behind this door was tied to everything, Carrington, the murders, and the new string of hints that had led me back to this forsaken place. With trembling fingers, I turned the handle. The door creaked open with a metallic groan, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. I hesitated at the threshold, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. The air inside was thick and foul, like something long dead had been rotting in there for years. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the floor beneath me. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The room was small, no more than a forgotten storage space, but as I shined my light across the far corner, I saw it, a steel operating table, its surface covered in old, rusted tools. And lying on the table, strapped down with thick leather restraints, was a figure. A woman. Her body was frail, almost skeletal, her skin pale and bruised. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could hear her shallow breathing. My throat tightened as I approached, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. How long had she been down here? And how was she still alive? I leaned in closer, and that's when I saw the scars. Jagged, cruel scars that ran across her arms, her legs, and her face. They looked like they had been made by surgical tools, precise but brutal. My stomach churned. This wasn't just a victim. This was someone who had been tortured, experimented on, for years. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. Her eyes were wide and hollow, filled with a terror I couldn't begin to understand. Her lips parted, and she whispered again, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Help, me." I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, to leave her and whatever horrors had been done to her behind. But I couldn't. I had to know the truth. What happened here? I whispered, my voice shaking. Who did this to you? Her eyes darted toward the shadows at the far end of the room, where the darkness seemed to deepen. I followed her gaze, dread settling in my bones. Carrington, she croaked, her voice raw. And, him. I froze. Him. The one I had been chasing, the shadowy figure that had been haunting the halls of Briarcliff. I had thought Carrington was the mastermind, but now it was clear. Carrington hadn't been working alone. There had been someone else, pulling the strings, guiding him in his madness. M. Graves, I whispered, the name finally clicking into place. Her body trembled as she nodded weakly. He made Carrington do it. Promised him, everything. Money, power. But it was him. Graves. He's still, watching. A chill ran down my spine. Graves had been orchestrating everything. Carrington was just a puppet, a pawn in whatever twisted game this man had been playing. And now, years later, Graves was still pulling the strings, still killing, still leaving clues like breadcrumbs for me to follow. My mind raced. If Graves had been behind everything, then why was he still taunting me? What was his endgame? The woman's breathing grew shallower, her eyes glazing over. I could feel her slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to save her. Whatever experiments she had been subjected to, they had destroyed her from the inside out. Before I could ask her anything more, a noise came from behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I spun around, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness of the hallway beyond the door. My blood ran cold as I saw a figure standing there, tall, shadowed, and unmistakably familiar. It was him. Graves. He stepped forward, his face still hidden in the gloom, but I could feel his presence, malevolent and suffocating. "You've come too far, detective," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "It's time to end this." I backed away, my heart racing. "What do you want, Graves? Why did you do this?" He chuckled softly, the sound sending chills down my spine. Carrington was a fool. I gave him everything, money, power, freedom to indulge his sick desires. But he couldn't finish what we started. Now, I have to clean up his mess. My grip tightened on the flashlight. "You killed all those people. For what? Money?" His laugh echoed off the walls, dark and twisted. "Money? No. Money was just the bait. Power, control, that's what this is about. And you've been such a helpful little pawn. I felt my stomach drop. He had been using me, leading me here. But for what? As if reading my thoughts, he stepped closer, his face finally illuminated by the weak light of my flashlight. His eyes glinted with a sinister glee. "It's time for the final piece, detective," he whispered. "The final murder. Yours." I turned to run, but the door behind me slammed shut, sealing me in with the man who had orchestrated years of terror. My heart pounded in my ears as I realized there was no way out. The door slammed behind me with a force that echoed through the dark room, sealing me inside with Graves. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him, the man who had orchestrated every murder, every moment of terror. He had manipulated Carrington, used him as a puppet, and now I was his final target. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Graves smiled, a cold, twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. "All this time," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance, "you thought you were the hunter. But you were just the bait." My pulse raced, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. I had walked right into his trap. The woman on the operating table, the cryptic messages, the clues, all designed to lead me here, into his web. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice barely steady. "Why keep this going for so long?" Graves took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Because, detective," he said, his tone darkening, "you were always supposed to be part of the story. The murders, the asylum, everything was just the beginning. I needed someone to carry on the legacy, someone who would understand the game." I swallowed hard, trying to think of a way out. "You think this is a game?" I spat, anger rising in my chest. "You ruined lives. You killed people. For what? Control." His grin widened, and I saw the madness flickering in his eyes. "Control, power, influence, those are just words. What I truly wanted was to create fear, to sow chaos. Carrington was too weak to see it through, but I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't be able to resist." I glanced back at the woman on the table, her breathing now shallow, barely clinging to life. She was just another victim, another piece in his sick puzzle. And now he was turning that puzzle on me. "You're insane," I whispered, my voice thick with disgust. But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't stop him. Graves wasn't here for redemption. He was here for the final act. Without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react, swinging the flashlight wildly as I stumbled backward. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls as Graves closed in, his movements quick and deliberate. My mind raced as I scrambled to keep distance between us, but the room was small, and the walls seemed to close in with every second. Graves grabbed the flashlight from my hand, throwing it across the room. The light sputtered out as it crashed into the corner, plunging us into near-total darkness. Panic surged through me as I backed into the cold, metal surface of the operating table. Graves was right there, his breath hot against my skin. "You won't leave here alive," he hissed, his voice filled with malice. Instinctively, I grabbed one of the rusted surgical tools from the table and swung it blindly in the dark. The blade caught him on the shoulder, and Graves let out a sharp cry of pain. He staggered back, clutching the wound, and I took the opportunity to move. I felt my way toward the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the handle. "You're not getting away," Graves growled from the darkness, his footsteps heavy behind me. I yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my ears as I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. Graves was getting closer, his footsteps growing louder with every passing second. In the panic, my fingers brushed against the bundle of papers still tucked into my jacket, the journal entries, the notes, the letters. And then it hit me. I hadn't come here alone. The evidence was still in my hand. The truth of what Graves had done, what Carrington had been involved in, was all there. If I could get out, if I could survive this, I could bring it all to light. I could stop him. But first, I had to survive. I turned back toward the operating table, hoping for some kind of weapon, anything to defend myself. And then, I saw her, the woman. She was stirring. Weak, barely alive, but her hand was moving, reaching for something. Before I could process what was happening, the woman let out a low, guttural sound, a sound of pure agony, and in her hand, clutched tightly, was a scalpel. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperation I couldn't comprehend. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the scalpel from her hand just as Graves reached me, his face twisted in rage. Enough, he roared, lunging forward. But this time, I was ready. With all the strength I had left, I drove the scalpel into his chest. Graves' eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he just stood there, staring at me. His body trembled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled back, clutching at the wound as blood seeped through his fingers. "This isn't over," he gasped, his voice weakening. But it was over. I watched as the life drained from his eyes, and he collapsed to the floor, his body hitting the cold ground with a sickening thud. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Graves was dead. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. A soft whisper filled the room, a voice so faint I barely heard it. "Thank you." I turned to the woman on the table, but her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. She was gone. I had been too late to save her, but maybe, in some way, she had saved me. I stumbled out of the room, leaving Graves' body behind as I made my way back through the dark hallways of Briarcliff. The papers in my hand felt heavier than ever. I had survived, but the horrors of what had happened here would never leave me. As I stepped into the cold night air, I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The asylum was silent now, but the memories of what had taken place within its walls would haunt me forever. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, Graves' legacy wasn't truly dead. The darkness he had unleashed would find a way to crawl back into the light. But for now, I was alive. And the hunt was finally over.